Alright, hello everybody. Today I want to talk a little bit about Weaver. So over the Christmas period, I've played maybe 75 to 100, 125 games on a Sword Weaver build. I've been playing pretty standard Menders. I've also, I guess I'm on Sage right now. I've also tried Sage. I've also tried a little bit of Marshals, but mostly I've been playing Menders. I've played a lot with different specialization lines. I think I even tried a couple of Marauder Qs a bit. But generally, the meta spec, as far as most people understand it, that being Earth Runes, that being a Weaver on Arcane and Water. And I want to talk a bit about this build and why it's so crap. Not just crap, but bad for the game as well. Why I don't really like it very much. And then some balance suggestions for how I would improve it. Because I do think that Sword Weavers should have a bit of a space in Guild Wars at the moment. And they kind of don't. So yeah, let's say, first of all, basically, the main identifying thing about this build is it's a side noder, a duelist. I've done a video on that recently you can check out. It goes for its 1v1s. It eliminates overly aggressive builds without much sustain of their own by sustaining a ton itself, and it seeks to be on small engagements and win as many 1v1s as possible. It basically isn't meta and won't ever be meta because it's crowded out by better side noders that not only can win 1v1, so like this won't really go against a Soul Beast who's playing very well, right, at all. And you know, that kicks it down a notch. It's a very binary situation there, but also a lot of those other builds have better potential for supporting their allies in small fights and surviving while outnumbered. Now, this thing can survive very well while outnumbered as well and can escape pretty well while outnumbered, but it really doesn't have too much 2v2 potential at the same time. The build really is best identified as just like this invincible thing that evades, if you're playing it properly, evades forever, escapes, and does basically no damage. And outside of talking about dedicated supports, this build is unquestionably the lowest damage build I think I've ever played in Guild Wars 2. It is so low that you'll like nearly every single game heal for significant quantities of health more than you do damage. Like if you've healed for 200,000 health, you've done like 150,000 damage, if that, maybe even less, right? And sometimes the stars align and you're against people who just eat all of your attacks and basically have no counter pressure, and you get about the same amount of damage as you do healing. But basically you just stand there hitting people with a wet pool noodle until eventually, hopefully, they die because, you know, they've rotated into a terrible matchup. You never actually succeed on this build feeling like it's because you're good, or for me anyway. I succeed on this build because I know my opponents have made a terrible, dumb, idiotic mistake rotating into me when they really shouldn't have. So yeah, it's kind of a rubbish build in that it feels very uninteractive to fight against, since you're just fighting against tons of evades and tons of sustain. There's no real significant big thing to watch out for either. It just kind of spams out lots of little attacks with, you know, continuously rolling damage, and it's just not very impactful whatsoever. So it's pretty lame, I think. I don't really like the build that much. Well, I like playing it and I like the play style, but I wish it was better for both people fighting against it and for actually executing its own stuff. So how would we change that? Well, first of all, let's just identify the big problem. For me, I would say it has too much sustain. The fact it has so many evades and so much gimmicky, like, just evasion uptime and dodge uptime means that it also can't have any damage either. So if you reduce its sustain, you create space for the devs to actually put some damage on it. And that's mostly what I'm going to be trying to do. Find a way for it to get damage, so, and, you know, to cull away its sustain stuff. So let's talk about why that is in terms of traits. And it's very easy to see. It's the three specialization lines you're kind of forced to pick. So first of all, we're a Weaver, so the bottom line is non-negotiable. Really, the only way to make the build work right now is to go Arcane and Water. You're locked into these two lines. Some people, yes, have been trying Fire already. Pair it with a Signet of Fire, see what you can do there. I've tried the Fire variant many times. I genuinely don't think the added pressure it gets is worth enough to justify the swap, but I get that there is on the fringes a little bit of Fire out there at the moment. But largely, you're locked into these two lines, and I want to talk about why. So first of all, you're kind of locked into Water for two big things. Healing Ripple, which is give yourself a substantial heal whenever you go into Water attunement, and also Cleansing Water. which means that you can actually fight against the ludicrously power-crept Mesmer stuff that's around, and, you know, you actually have a worthwhile matchup against a lot of the other more reasonable Condi builds that are out there as well at the moment. So there's a lot valuable about the line, don't get me wrong, but I'm saying the big things is these two traits here, really. It's Healing Ripple and it's Cleansing Water. And when you try and run a Fire variant, or when you try and run a Lightning Rod variant, what you're going to find is you really miss these two. They hit your sustain massively. So you kind of feel locked into Water for that. And then when it comes to Arcane, you're going to feel locked into Arcane because of his protection uptime more than anything else. But pretty much everything in Arcane is really good. The lower cooldowns is idealistically synergistic with you know, Weaver in general. Evasive Arcana has a ton of value, particularly dodge rolling in Water, but also being able to get your blinds out there, extra blast for more might, extra blast for all kinds of things, you know, even your water fields. And then lastly, the protection as well. The protection uptime from Elemental Contingency and from Elemental Attunement. This is really, really, really important to the build. You swap off Arcane and you feel the pain here, really. I'll note as well that getting, like, Retaliation feels pretty good, and you do feel your pressure goes down without that. There's Sustain even on this minor. Arcane you feel pretty locked into, but it's not for two major reasons. It's for a lot of little reasons, and some even feeling quite major on their own. So, because you've ran these, you have no space for air, which is where a lot of the Elementalist damage is packaged away into. You have no space for fire, which is where, again, also a lot of their damage is locked into. So, if I were to change this, what I would try to do is remove the dependency at Swordweaver's feel. And I'm talking purely about side-noding Swordweaver playstyle throughout this entire video. Don't be unclear on that, guys. What I would try and do is remove their dependency on one of these two lines, thus allowing them to, or maybe I'll try a weird-ass Condi thing utilizing Earth, which is a silly idea, but or I will try actually adding some air pressure in there, or I will try adding some fire, as you see some people are starting to dip their toes into because of the cleanse that's now become available on fire. I think the devs are trying to do this too, which is why we've seen cleanse become a thing in the fire line. But yeah, so which of the two lines would I actually try and delete our dependency on? I'm gonna pick Water. I actually have a lot of reasons for why I would like to not feel forced into Water. I don't mind feeling forced into Arcane. Now, I'm picking Water to delete for this build and playstyle for a lot of different reasons. First of all, Water will always have use for the profession in the game in general for support builds. There will be support builds in raids. There will be support builds out in world versus world scenarios. There will be support builds even here in PvP if you're a Tempest that utilize Water. If Water isn't reliant for this, it's still got so much place in the game. It's fine. Also, I would pick Water because the traits themselves are all very passive and unvisually impactful, unflavorfully impactful. They're all, you know, things that you can't necessarily counter or think about when you're against the Ellie. They're all just generally kind of boring things, right? Like pure passives is what we're looking at most of the time. The closest you get away from that maybe is Soothing Ice. So while Arcane has got all this interesting stuff like dodging, producing prominent effects and getting various boons procced by hitting certain people, full damage on activation traits, on res activation traits, Arcane's like exciting and interesting. Water, generally speaking, isn't. Also, I think that you can break the Weaver's dependency on Water much easier than you can break their dependency on Arcane, because in Water it's just a couple of things that are the outliers. It's like, well, we fix and change these and we can fix it, or we can remove this dependency. For Arcane, you're like looking at all kinds of different things filled everywhere. Also, I would make an argument that Arcane's like Elementalist's fifth line. It's like that special line. It's kind of supposed to have broad application. You see this on a lot of classes. It's supposed to be a good pick for a variety of playstyles, like a definitive thing for Ellie. So I think it's to be expected that competitive good builds would be running something like this, just like you see on the other builds, the other professions in the game. And finally, it's something I mentioned earlier. There's a lot of like ideological similarities between Weaver and Arcane. Weaver's all about like double attuning and attuning lots, and Arcane's about attuning a lot and swapping attunements a lot. You know, there's some fun stuff there. So if any build should feel, if any elite spec should feel paired with Arcane, I think it should be this one. So we should be comfortable with that. So that's a lot of really strong reasons, I think, to be okay with these. Is like, if you're a Weaver, you're going to have these. I think we should feel all right with that. I really do. But Water I'd like to break. So again, let me reiterate. I think the main things that we really struggle without are Healing Ripple, which is the big cleanse, the big heal when you swap into Water. and also cleansing water. Just for the newbies out there, or those who are watching this out of a sense of curiosity and don't really know the class very well, this Grandmaster is cleanse conditions from allies you grant regeneration to. And when you're a Weaver, you can pick up this trait here, Woven Stride, which is give yourself regeneration whenever you get Swiftness or Super Speed. So anything that gives me Swiftness or Super Speed gives me regen, which cleanses me. So I get regen, I get cleanse. I get regen, I get cleanse. And this is a really fun combo, and I love, like, interactions between specializations like this. I like the idea of the way that the devs did this in a roundabout way. But this is why, you know, we can compete, because through the two we have a lot of selfish cleanse for ourselves. You can do really fun things like run evasion runes, which is whenever you evade, you get swiftness, and now the swiftness becomes regen, and the regen becomes a cleanse. Like, that kind of stuff's cool, right? And you'll see stuff like our air auto attacks have swiftness on them. So auto attacking starts cleansing us because auto gives regen, gives cleanse. Or if we have a lightning field, we can blast in it and we can cleanse ourselves. Or now like updraft becomes a cleanse, and swapping to air attunement becomes a cleanse. Things that you never felt before. So it's a cool interaction, but that is really why we feel so locked in. So how do we fix this? Well, the first thing I would do, and it breaks this whole idea of a fun interaction, but I think it's the smartest way to do it, and people have been saying it for a long time. I would take the trait Woven Stride, and I would just simply make it Swiftness is worth more on you if you really feel that's necessary. I don't. I would get rid of that as bloat. But I would simply change it and say, whenever you get Swiftness or Super Speed, cleanse yourself. That's it. I would remove all the other bloat on this altogether. I did another video talking about balance. This video I'm doing here is after I have the experience of playing a lot of this build, by the way, so I have more insights than last time you would have heard me talking about this, and that's why I want to present it to you here. And what that means is we no longer need water for the cleansing aspect of all of this, and all we're really missing out on is Healing Ripple. The other thing it does, actually, is it nerfs the regeneration access of the Sword Weavers, which is kind of cool, but you don't have to think about that too much, because if we're assuming you're going to be Arcane anyway, you have regeneration, and you're going to have regeneration splashing around from this trait line, right? So I actually think that overall it's not this tweak on paper all on its own doesn't even look like a big buff necessarily, but it's a reshuffle that ultimately means we can start moving away from water, which is very good. What I would also say as well, by the way, is this trait down here, Invigorating Strikes, I would like to reshuffle as well. What I think you should do as a Sword Weaver is you should look in the pre-game lobby at who you're about to fight, and if you think you're going to be in lots of Condi 1v1s, I think you should be able to pick Woven Stride. And I think if you think you're going to be in power-oriented 1v1s, you should be able to pick Invigorating Strikes. And you can kind of make that decision in your own mind. You can kind of already do that by subbing entire specializations lines off. But I'd like to look at more just the Grandmaster. Not too many people run Invigorating Strikes. It doesn't get enough of a look in, even though it seeks to be a very similar kind of sustain-oriented trait here. It's funny that two of the Grandmasters are so sustain-oriented with a class that was originally advertising itself, it seemed to be kind of a glassy thing. You know, this was like the Elementalist version of Reaper, if anything. The early observations would have you think. Anyway, so what I would actually do is I would take Invigorating Strikes and tweak this slightly as well. I would have this just gain barrier whenever you hit with a dual attack. Not gain vigor whenever you use a dual attack. I don't like the constant dodging and stuff. I would just have that be gain barrier. Now, we already have that as a minor, for what it's worth here, Elemental Refreshment. I would say you can compound the two. And one of the reasons why I think barrier would be really good to give people more of, particularly in the power matchup, is you can actually get away with quite low vitality when you have heaps of cleanse for the Condi matchup, because you can cleanse it as quickly as it comes through before it can really start ramping on you. But when you're very low vitality, you get majorly punished by power builds. So if you give the Weavers a trait that stacks a lot of barrier on them, they can get away with that. Which also, by the way, opens up a little bit more amulet discussion, and maybe the potential for Martial, which is more damage but hasn't got the vitality there, right? Our vitality drops massively. I think that really these builds should be on Martial. I think this is the perfect amulet for this kind of idea for a build. But right now, Ellie's really struggled to be on Martial because they don't have the vitality. So if you get, for the power matchups particularly, so if you give them barrier as a supplement, so they've kind of got more health a lot of the time because they have so much barrier access, well, that's better. Also, barrier is a more interactive thing to break through than just evades constantly, yeah? So I'd get rid of the vigor aspect of this, and I would have it gain barrier after a dodge, and also gain barrier on dual attacks, which stacking with that might mean something pretty cool, right? So, and you kind of decide, am I going to be against more Condi, in which case I'll take Woven Stride, or am I going to be against more power? I'll take this. And in some situations, you're going to be against a bit of both, and that's kind of the magic and the fun of the game, deciding which GM you want to go for and whether you made a mistake or not, right? So, with all of that said, we're now in a much better place where we really feel like we can move away from water, pick up fire, and now all of a sudden there's some damage that we can actually get on this build a little bit more, and it can be a bit more impactful. But there is still one thing on water that we kind of haven't addressed, and that's Healing Ripple, and you really do feel quite bad when you lose Healing Ripple. So, there is another change I would make to Weaver here that makes this feel more tolerable. We can move away from it. And that's actually one of its skills. I would try and supplement some of this heal that feels necessary by buffing the Weaver heal skill, Aquatic Stance. So nobody really runs Aquatic Stance. People favor Signet, and I don't think it's just people getting stuck in the past and reliving the DDLE dream and whatnot, where Signet was always the mainstay. I would actually look at Aquatic Stance, and the idea here is overall, I would want this to heal you more, so that you don't feel reliant on Healing Ripple when we move on. But also, I have other reasons for liking the idea of buffing Aquatic Stance, and thus shifting many of these builds away from the Signet and onto this skill instead. And so I'll go through that list, my reasons for wanting this to be more of a thing. First of all, quite simply, it's like you've just introduced a new skill into the game if you buff something like this, right? Nobody really uses it, you don't see it much, and now all of a sudden it's a thing. That's nice. I think that it rounds out the build a little bit more as well, as you can see there as I'm mousing over it, because if you are taking the stability trait, which, let's face it, if you're in this role, you probably are, you get a little bit more stab access, so you're a little bit more potent when it comes to down states and stomps and whatnot, because you have that little bit more access there as well, which overall increases its viability without leaning on this like sustain gimmick. I also would want to buff this, because really my whole mindset right now is I'm thinking about the sword builds, and to a lesser extent dagger main hand, but that would be a different story. I don't really want to talk about staff, I don't really want to talk about scepter. And Aquatic Stance buff is kind of nice because it doesn't really affect Scepter and Staff. If you guys don't know what this is, it's a stance when you enter it. As you strike people, it causes water to splash out around them, not you, them, which you can be healed by if you're next to them. So Scepter and Staff builds don't really seek to be in melee like that a lot of the time. So it's kind of a dud skill for them, just philosophically instantly, right? But so it's, you know, it's a way of buffing a kind of core Weaver thing, but still thinking mostly about the build that we're thinking about. I also think that this would be very good to be better for these side noders, for these 1v1ers, because it actually, this is an AoE heal, and that improves your player interaction potential and 2v2 value. So right now, one of the things is like this build, if you compare, like a Soul Beast has so much quality of life in terms of healing his allies and providing really good boons and stuff to his allies as well. While the Weaver kind of struggles, it's like, oh, I can attune to water near you. Oh, please stand near me for a while so that I can maybe blast in this thing. It's just not very good. But if you do Aquatic Stance, you've actually got more potent sustaining and rezzing people up and healing around in these kind of close quarters 2v2s. So I think that's very much synergistic with the style of Conquest we're looking at here as well. Also, for what it's worth, this build is terrible in team fights and large matchups, like awful. However, Aquatic Stance being buffed might improve your value in those just a little bit. Again, that's a thing where other side noders are a lot better. Another really important reason is this is actually interactive for the opponent in a really fun way. Signet, if you're fighting against an Ellie on Signet, you can't think about it or do anything about it at all. You can just fight them and hope you've got high poison uptime or whatever, right? There's really not much going on there. You're not going to try and CC lock them in terms of denying Signet value. Come on. However, Aquatic Stance is like one of these really fun heals. It's a bit like IED, right? Where you see it's up, you see that something's going on, and you can decide now to kite away and try and deny those impact strikes. And there's actual counterplay. There's things to think about. And particularly when we talk about 1v1s on nodes, this is really cool because it adds more of that interplay where it's like, oh, I want to deny his Aquatic Stance value, but I also don't want to get decapped. Can I kite around on the nodes in such a way that I avoid a lot of attacks but don't get decapped? Or am I going to force to be getting decapped here, but it's worth it so that I win the fight overall? Like, these are interesting questions that people start asking one another in these 1v1s, in these real games, that you never would with Signet of Restoration. So I would always value something that's actually interactive and visible and makes you think about things. So, you know, I think it's a crime that really we look at Signet a lot more. So, yeah, that's most of the reasons. And lastly, the nature of this skill is that you are sustaining through aggression. It's a lot like Guardians with their meditations, right? Their meditation heal. You are asking Weavers to do more damage here, to have more impact. Well, this allows them to resustain while continuing to focus on actually putting pressure out, right? So that, again, is another thing that is exactly in line with where we're trying to put this build into something that can actually be a bit more aggressive. This gets to sustain you for being aggressive and continue to be in that place and actually have a little bit more impact. So that's a plethora of reasons. I really think that Aquatic Stance deserves to be stronger to be in the game. And what you would look at is a Weaver build that can pick up fire or air, whichever one you'd prefer. I think fire would be more of the choice, and you'd actually just look at them running this skill here now with the choice of the GMs. I think we'd be in a really nice place. There's the question of how you could buff Aquatic Stance as well. I've just said, oh, buff it. It's kind of a different discussion on how to, but some thoughts. You can increase the radius on the heals. That kind of idea of the 2v2 and supporting allies through striking and getting value off Aquatic Stance. I think maybe it does need a bit of a radius increase for that. I would also suggest, obviously, just increasing the amount it heals, but I'd only ever increase it baseline. I wouldn't increase what it scales with healing power necessarily. I don't want this to be kind of a thing where you'd rather be a support Weaver than Tempest. That's not a thing I don't think that I would want to encourage. You could add more maximum count recharges on it. Though that could be frustrating if it's coming up a bit too much. The other idea I really like is you could nerf the initial heal on it to be even lower, and it's tiny already. But you could nerf it to be even lower, but remove the cast time whatsoever. And you might say, oh, no, WP. The thing is, it's on a 3/4 of a second cast time anyway. Those skills rarely get interrupted in the first place. So eliminating the potential of being interrupted, you might think is terrible. But, again, the whole idea is then you can deny them getting value from it by moving away, right? And countering it in the same way you would with an IED or a Medi Guardian. I think that there is a lot of value in that, and that's really fun and interactive. So you lower the initial heal, you nerf the initial heal, but get rid of the cast time and really load it on getting those strikes. And it's an ammo skill as well, so that would feel really bad if you're an Ellie, you pop your heal and you get no value out of it. But it's an ammo skill, so it's kind of got baked in a life save for that, you know. So I think if any skill is going to work like that, it's going to be an ammo-based skill. And yeah, you could give it more ammo as well. I feel like adding more ammo is a very quick recipe for making things very overpowered, though, so you'd have to be kind of careful. So yeah, you've got all of that. Now, what else would I change? At that point, I really think it would be looking better. But there is a question of the damage itself. So it's not just enough to say, oh, pick up fire and now it does enough damage. It does. Picking up fire barely changes the damage of this build. It really does. So how would I change that? First of all, the lazy thing to say is just increase the impacts on the strikes. I mean, it's kind of crazy. I played a game, right, where I was like 0-2. I'd lost like 2 1v1s or something, right? So we were maybe 5 or 6 minutes into the game. There's like 9 minutes left on the clock, 8 minutes left on the clock. And all I've done is I've been fighting and fighting and fighting. And I've like died twice. So I've not really done very much. It's a bad game, right? And I remember respawning, playing this build, and looking at the damage I'd done. And I'd done like 70,000 damage. It was like 6 minutes in the game. I'd done like 70k damage. And I thought, wow, that's so low. And I remembered that what had just killed me was a warrior who'd pressed like F1 on his greatsword. And he chunked me for like 9k through my barrier and stuff for like 9k. And I just sat there thinking, you know, that guy in one key press did like 1/6 of all my damage the entire game so far in one button. You know, Sword Weavers just don't have anything like that, anywhere near the impact that the Hollows and the Warriors have, and even Soul Beasts and whatnot have, that are more ideologically aligned, right? When they're sitting there in their Axe 5s and stuff, there's just nothing there. Even with the ton of might, which you can try and stack up on yourself through very, very careful portioning out of blasts in fire fields, you're just so low impact. You're kind of like that death by 1,000 cuts style idea. I get it. So you're not going to see any individual big numbers. But it's just a very low pressure build. And I know what some of you guys are saying. Well, obviously, because it's on a tanky-ass amulet and it's running tanky-ass specialization lines and blah, blah, blah. If you changed it into glassy things, it could do big damage. And that's absolutely correct, to be fair. The problem that I think the developers struggle with, and most people do when they think about Ellie, is they don't realize the uphill battle any Ellie build always has to deal with. Because it is just baseline, matter of fact, minimum armor value, minimum vitality. It is the glassiest thing in the game. If you're going to put a sword on that and ask it to wade into melee, it's going to be suicide. So that's why they're forced into all this other tanky stuff just to have any impact, and we're left at like this weird gimmick. Clearly then, I say, the compensation to bring it to a reasonable bar has to be higher baseline values on these skills. And the devs didn't do that for Path of Fire for some reason. I wonder if that's the PvE elements of this game's community muddying the waters, because people in PvE have no comprehension or care in the world for any of this. Look at any discussion about Necromancer and Reaper, for example. Any sense of sustain and vitality just is completely thrown away. But it's important in PvP, and I think the compensation should be there with higher values. So first of all, I think that a lot of the on-activated skills kind of could be hitting harder. Like Pyro Vortex feels such low pressure. Flame Uprising feels extremely low pressure. Cauterizing Strike, this thing should be hitting like a fire grab. The idea of it is it's basically fire grab, but it's like a less accessible fire grab that does way less damage. Like, it's crazy to think about, but that's actually the situation you're in. The dual-attuned air attack as well. It's so low pressure. You can sometimes feel getting the extra damage out because you've landed maybe 6 or 7 key skills in a row. You know, on most builds, you've got like 3 or 4 skills, and you know if you get them all in a row and none of it gets mitigated, you're pretty much won. On a Weaver, it's like land 7 or 8 in a row, and then maybe in about 10 seconds or so, the attrition of that will ultimately result in a kill, right? If people eat absolutely everything. So, yeah, I just feel like it really needs higher baseline opportunities on a lot of what it actually has available. And as a trade-off for that, I would sincerely increase the cooldown on Riptide. The first thing that was majorly evident, this is one of the big evades, right? The first thing that was majorly evident to me playing this build is Riptide's cooldown is way too low. This is ridiculous. So if you're going to give it its damage, start hitting these evades, man. And Riptide would be the first one that I would seriously bump the cooldown up on. Looking at traits themselves as well, though, I would actually like to make a change to Fire. Which I do think offers some nice pressure and even a little bit of cleanse potential now as well. There's even maybe some value in running Persisting Flames on this because, you know, it lengthens the Flame Uprising. It gives you better Fury access. You're already going to have a bit from Arcane. But what I'd actually like to look at is Pyromancer's Poissons, which is a brilliant might stacker on most aspects of Elementalist now, especially in PvP where it has been getting buffed. You know that the devs want to do this, right? They want to, I think they've correctly identified eliminating water dependency as well, by the way, which is why we see Cleanse on Fire. And they've been buffing Pyromancer's Poissons. The problem is on a Weaver, you don't spend too long in Fire attunement. So I would actually reorient this trait. And I know that they want it to be a ramp trait, and what I'm proposing would keep it as a ramp trait. What I would basically just have it be is gain a ton of might when you enter Fire. And they may have resisted that in the past because they're like, no, we don't want it to be about attunement swapping lots. We want it to be about camping Fire to an extent for a while, so you ramp up. But the thing is, on a Weaver, you kind of dip into Fire and then you're out again, and then you dip in and you're out again. You dip in, so you kind of are ramping anyway, right? By choosing to go in and out of it. And I'd give it like a big might amount on just entering. And what that does is that frees up the rest of the Weaver to, you know, maintain these kind of... Most other builds in the game at the moment that are in these playstyles are maintaining ridiculously high might. And this would allow you to do it really comfortably, right? And now with all that might, that actually supplements the rest of the build, and it can kind of accomplish things on its own in these environments. So yeah, that's actually what I changed. I would tweak Pyromancer's Poissons to be when you enter Fire, and it's like a big packet of might for you. I also think, by the way, a lot of Ellie builds could do with Blinding Ashes going down, but maybe we'll talk about that later. By later, I mean in another video at another point in time. So yeah, that's what I would do about the pressure. The last thing maybe I would like to see is, again, the pure skills. They take a lot to go for. You have to be very sure that you really want to go for these. And Quantum Strike feels a little bit lackluster to me. The idea is like you hit them and then they're going to continuously getting hit over the next while. But the thing is, a lot of the sword skills kind of feel like they do that. What I would actually rather is Quantum Strike to change quite substantially, in that you land it, and yeah, it can be a small impact if it lands, but once it lands, what it should do is place in the area kind of a mini lightning field. A bit like, visually it doesn't have to be very big, and the damage doesn't have to be too crazy, but I would like that rolling pressure to be kind of a more AoE actual thing on the ground. And when I say lightning field, I really mean lightning field, which means that now when I'm blasting and stuff, I'm giving myself swiftness, and I have more cleanse opportunities and just fun interactions there, because we don't really get, the airfields that we can blast. We've got the other varieties, but not necessarily that. And that might feel like a more fun, impactful thing to actually land when you do that. So yeah, that's what I would propose. Nerf the evades, nerf the vigor access, nerf the cooldown on evade-oriented stuff, but actually buff its access to damage. Find some ways to eliminate the dependency on water. Arcane, I think, is perfectly fine. And then maybe you can open up some... what I think would happen, the ideal world, what they should really be trying to do, is have sword weavers in this playstyle would probably identify with fire. And you would find dagger weavers in this playstyle would be looking more at air, because they've got the shocking aura and they've got the mudslides, and you could have like a dagger focus build that's more about proccing lots of lightning rods, and you'd have a sword build that's more about ramping burning and getting sort of that hybrid condi pressure. I think that a martial amulet is the thing that the devs should be aiming for, but it's difficult because this is such a low vitality class anyway. You really have to be able to supplement that stuff with barrier. And barrier is so much better than evades, please, for Christ's sake. So there you go. That's my thoughts on Weaver, where it is right now. And when I say it's a bad build, it's an okay build. It's an alright build, and I like what it's trying to do and how fun it attempts to be and the ideas behind it. But that's what I'd say. You'll notice I've got no real thoughts for utilities and stuff. I would actually like Weave Self to be a power modifier on Woven Fire, not just condition modifier. I think that'd be good for fresh air variants as well, but that's kind of a different story. I think these three utilities and, Signet of Fire swapping on sometimes, maybe some other things. By the way, a thing that would radically change Ellie and be really interesting is if at any point these conjures became like kit style things that you can instantly equip. I like that they're different and they're actually summoned right now. But Primordial Stance is a slot that currently could be filled by any of these if their access was a bit better. Anyway, so there you go. That's my thoughts on the build, having played a lot of it, just for what it's worth. And I'll see you guys next time.